All right, in this lesson, we're going to talk about risk management. Going to introduce two different tools that'll help us, um, you know, kind of categorize and assess conditions so that it can help us make that final decision of maybe it's a go, no go, or maybe it is helping us understand what we're working with so we can pick the appropriate locations to run our course or to run our basic skills course, keeping in mind, that class 0 water classification that we're kind of aiming for. So let's jump into the slide. So we're going to look at two different categorization models that we can use to help us assess conditions. We're going to look at a decision-making tool that kind of helps us, decide, is this a yes or a no in each condition? And then we're going to look at an example that I want you to have a look at that we'll be reviewing together once we're doing the in-person portion of the lesson. All right, so let's jump in. All right, risk management. So I'm going to start with some definitions so that we're on the same page or the same understanding of how we are viewing risk. So I like this method here, where we break risk into three different categories: hazard, risk, and then risk mitigation. So our job as instructors, that we can see here at the bottom, is our role is to identify hazards, assess the risk associated with each hazard, mitigate the risk where possible, and if risks cannot be mitigated, we can use the below models to make go, no go decisions. So starting with hazard, I look at hazard as that first thing that we're looking for. Hazard is any source of potential damage, harm, or adverse health effects on something or someone. Examples: land formations, natural or man-made, wind. Hazards can pose a risk to equipment. It can pose a risk to the participants in the class. It can pose different risks. So we have hazards. Then we have risk. So risk is the chance or probability that a person will be harmed or experience an adverse health effect if exposed to a hazard. Example: strong winds can be a risk to new paddlers. And then our job as instructors is, once we understand the hazards, once we understand the risks associated with those hazards, how do we mitigate them? Risk mitigation is determine appropriate ways to eliminate the hazard or control the risk when the hazard cannot be eliminated. Example: we can mitigate the risk of high winds by using natural or man-made windbreaks. So we'll be looking at this again and again. Every time we get on the water, when we're in person, we're going to be doing this assessment. And this assessment becomes part of our preparedness check, which we talk about in the next learning module. Preparedness is, what do we need to know and what do we need to tell people as part of our briefing before we head out? So let's come back to risk management. Let's look at an example here. Maybe in the place, like I paddle at Jericho Sailing Club a lot, and there is a rock retainer that helps hold the beach in place, rock wall retainer. And so one of the hazards in that area is rocks. The risk of the rock is if students paddle into it, they can damage the equipment. They can fall hard on their board because if they hit the rock, the board's going to stop. They might fall over. Risk might also be that they fall off the board and land on the rocks. So the risk often is going to be, there's a potential for equipment risk. The higher risk is that students injure themselves after coming in contact with the rocks. How do we mitigate the risk? The easy way is avoid the rocks. So risk mitigation in this case, and in my lessons, is notifying participants that there is a risk, that we need to stay away from it. What to do if you are getting close to it. If you are standing and you're coming close to the rocks, go to your knees. The risk is lower if students aren't standing if they hit a rock. The other risk is, or the other mitigation factor is, we're going to go in the opposite direction of the rocks. So we still might have a couple of stragglers who have trouble getting up, and they might kind of float towards them, but the majority of the group is moved away from them. And as an instructor, I have fewer people to work with. So mitigation is education. Educating them on what the risk is, what we need to do, what to do in case they come in contact with them or come close to them. And Yeah, so that's kind of it for rocks, you know. And then, worst case scenario, if there are so many and they're so windy that the paddlers are a high risk of blowing into them, well then, we probably need to pick a new location. Another example, hazard, in the same area. There's a lot of traffic. There's windsurfing lessons, there's kayaking lessons, there's canoe lessons, there's sailing lessons. Hazard is collisions. The risk is individuals or equipment, more importantly, the individual could get hurt in a collision. They could be, sometimes a paddleboard floats into a windsurfer that's moving fast, so they can be somewhat high speed. The risk is high of injury. Mitigation, we got to stay away from them. As paddleboarders, even though windsurfers, potentially have more maneuverability as a new student, they very likely have less. So we need to give the right of way to the windsurfer, so we avoid them. As an instructor, how do we help mitigate that risk? We educate the individuals in our class as to where the risk is, what the risk is. We tell them that we have to give the right of way. And again, if they're standing and they're not sure what to do or how to navigate their craft on the SUP, go to your knees. They're probably going to have more control if they don't have to worry about balance. And then I'm also going to pick a lesson plan that takes us straight out and, as much as possible, avoids collisions altogether. So my mitigation is education, give them an action to take if it looks like they're coming close, and also create a paddling plan that moves us away from it. So what I'd like you to do is get into the habit of looking, what are my hazards? What are the risks associated with them? Because if we know the risks, or we have to know the risks before we can come up with a solid mitigation plan. All right. Next, condition assessment. So we're going to use two different tools. The 4 W's is what we'll be using in class. So this is the easiest one. This is a good one for small outings, short lessons. So our 2 to 3 hour basic skills class is definitely a short-ish lesson. So it's a conditional assessment tool we use to help us decide what are the conditions, what do we have to do to be prepared to go out, and again, what's going to be my best lesson plan. And definitely risk and risk management is going to factor into all of this as well. So 4 W's is an easy one. 4 W's is an assessment tool paddlers use as part of their pre-paddling preparedness check. They should be assessed each time, the 4 W's, we get on the water. In a basic SUP lesson, we teach and review this at the beginning of a lesson to encourage students to do the same every time. So we'll use it in our lesson planning. We'll use it as part of our brief creation that we are briefing the students on before we get on the water. But as much as possible, I want my students to adopt this as a key part of the paddling lesson that they need to take and start doing on their own when they're going, every time they're going out. So the 4 W's are wind, water, waves, and weather. And I like 4 W's because, hey, all you have to do is remember what those, it's all W's. You just have to remember which each one is. So wind speed, direction, expected change in both. Water, more often than not, we look at temperature, but could also be depth, tides, quality. Water quality can change after a heavy rain. Quality meaning, is there bacteria in the water? Are there other things that we need to be conscious of? Spills, red tide, all sorts of different things that can affect water quality, but the big one is usually, especially in an urban area, E. coli. Waves. What wave action do we have? What are we expecting? When are we expecting wind to increase? Waves could also increase. Weather, rain, lightning, thunder, storm conditions, temperature. So lightning and thunder on the coast isn't as big a deal in Vancouver, an area we don't get a lot of thunderstorms, lightning storms. As soon as you get more interior and every other province, pretty much, it's a much higher likelihood. All right, so notice that we're looking at expected changes as well. So with the wind, expected changes in both direction and speed. With waves, are we expecting the wind to increase? Waves could increase. So when we are looking at our 4Ws, we need to look at a snapshot of what's happening right now. But as instructors, we also need to know what's going to happen while we're out there. So when we're looking at wind speed and we're going to go paddling at 10 o'clock in the morning, because that's when our lesson starts, if it's a 2-hour lesson, we need to look at wind speed, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and probably even 1 o'clock in case we're a little bit late. So we know, is it going to change? You know, if you've been paddling on bigger open water, especially in the summer, you know, you may be used to the fact that the wind, if it's going to increase, is probably going to be at its height shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So if we're doing a midday paddle, chances are good it's going to get faster. If wind increases, waves increase. If waves increase, you know, water conditions change, and we might suddenly end up in something outside of our class 0 requirement for the basic skills course. So keys here are: know the snapshot of what's happening right now and know what's expected while we're out on the water. So wind, big thing that we're going to be looking at is speed and direction. Where is it coming from? How fast is it going? That's going to tell us, give us an idea of what are we dealing with. If those winds are going to be a little bit higher, our paddlers are going to have more of a challenge. So water, temperature is the big one here. You know, at 20 degrees Celsius, you know, we're making calls when we look at water and weather, because weather could be rain and storms, but it's also outdoor temperature. If the water is 20 degrees Celsius, but the weather outside is 5 degrees Celsius, 100% we need exposure gear. Because if we fall in and get out, we're going to be cold in that 5 degrees. If it's 20 degrees but overcast, it could feel like 15, we probably still need a wetsuit, because if we fall out and when we are back in the air, if it's coolish, overcast, we don't have the sun to warm us up, we're going to be cold. Chances of hypothermia are increased. So wind, speed, direction, water, what's the temperature? We're going to use that as a measure of what are we going to wear. Waves, what are we expecting for conditions when we're out there? Is it going to be wavy? Is it going to be challenging for our participants? And weather, what's the air temperature? And sun exposure. So we're looking at exposure gear. We're looking at, do we need a hat that has a retainer on it so it doesn't blow away or it's tight enough? Do we need sunglasses that have a retainer on it so they don't fall off when we get on the board and risk falling in? And do we need a lot of extra sunscreen? Do we need to take some with us because we're going to be out a little bit longer? So all of this condition assessment starts painting a picture for us as to what do we need to do to prepare ourselves to go out? Because condition assessments really are the first step before understanding what we need to do to be prepared to go out paddling. Second assessment tool, the 4 pillars. So this is a variation, and I would use this one more so if I was going on a longer trip, if I was going to be out with a bigger group or a group that I didn't know and I was going to be out for, say, a full afternoon. I would probably start considering this one, and it wasn't, say, a basic lesson. A basic lesson, I know everyone's skills are going to be at a very entry level. If it's an afternoon and I'm just going out paddling with friends and I've never paddled with them before, you know, I would kind of run through this, ask them some questions about their experience and get an idea of, you know, what is it that we're dealing with out there? Because the 4 pillars gives us the human factor as well. So let's look at them from the top. 4 pillars is also an assessment tool used to aid in identifying potential hazards. The advantage of the 4 pillars model over the 4 Ws is that the 4 pillars incorporates the human factor. Weather refers to everything from the surface of the water up. So wind gust, weather changes, temperature, sunlight, lightning, storms. You know, this is kind of weather here is wind and weather combined from our 4 Ws. Sea state, everything from the water down. It could include waves, temperature, currents, tides. Terrain, can you use the shape of the shoreline to better set your participants up for success or mitigation? Terrain can also be, do we have easy access on and off the water in the middle of the lesson if it's our basic sup lesson, one of the requirements of Class C. One of the requirements of location. Is there breaking surf, which is going to make it harder to get on the water, but once we're past it, the water flattens out and it's easier. So terrain has to do with the land around us. what we can use, features of the land that we can use maybe to help us mitigate some wind if there's wind, but also considerations of how easy is it going to be to get on and off the water. The human factor, so this is a big one. You must take into consideration the skill level of each participant as well as their preparedness. Did someone fall in right away? Suddenly, we have a cold factor that we have to start considering. If they are not wearing a wetsuit and suddenly they're getting a little chilled, that's going to affect everyone because we have to work with them as an individual. If I don't have a second instructor on the water to send them back with to get warm, we all have to go back. So human factor includes experience, skill, size, fitness, preparedness, the gear they have. If we're going paddling for a full day and it's people are bringing their own equipment, that equipment that they bring has to factor into our condition assessment, because somebody may be able to paddle into wind because they have a displacement board, and somebody else might have a 6-inch inflatable that's modeled after a planing board, and they're going to struggle hard. So day needs to be adjusted based on the participants that are there. So again, 4 pillars, it's taking more into consideration. It's a variation on our 4 Ws. Grouping some of them together in weather, grouping some of them together in sea state, but taking more into consideration of our surrounding area, the surrounding area with terrain, and importantly, very importantly, the human factor. And again, we don't use the 4 pillars in a basic lesson because the human factor, we're not going to necessarily know. Chances are they're using our equipment, so we know what they're coming in with. We know that they have 0 to limited skills, so we know that everyone's at a very similar level. So we just assume that there's going to be struggles there. So we just need to look at everything else that's going on around us. So last line, consider the 4 pillars as the legs of a table. If you remove one leg, what happens? As stability decreases for us, risk increases. And that's kind of takes us into decision making. So with that last statement, if weather's good, sea state's good, terrain's good, but the human factor is questionable, is that enough to stop the event, stop the lesson? Or are there ways we can mitigate it? We come back to our hazard risk mitigation. If human factor is great, sea state is a little iffy, weather might be kind of cold, but terrain is rugged and maybe challenging, we have to look and see, are we losing one of the legs of our table? Or is it just kind of not great? So that takes us into the next tool. Risk management decision-making, the decision-making aid of traffic lights. So decision-making aid, traffic lights. We use the concept of a traffic light to help us easily assess and identify the degree of risk associated with identified hazards, usually used with the 4 pillars. If you get a red light on any of the 4 pillars, that's a no-go. A red light, so we have red light, green light, and yellow light. It's a traffic light. Red light is the same as taking one of the table legs away. A 4-legged table won't stand with 3 legs very well. 2 greens and a yellow, and 2 yellows, proceed with caution. 3 or 4 yellows, probably pull the plug. So in this example, this is an example that is in the manual. This is one we'll review together once we are all together as a group in our on-water portion. The exercise is for each pillar circle, and this is an example to get you thinking about it. So we have our 4 pillars: weather, sea state, terrain, human factor. In the top of each portion, I have the things that we need to consider within each category. So within weather, we're considering gusts, changes in air temperature, or wind gust, changes in wind gust, air temperature, lighting, and sun. Under sea state, we're looking at waves, sea temp, current, tide, terrain, exposure to shoreline, surf or not, boats, remoteness, vegetation, wildlife, how many sharks are in the water? Just kidding. Human factor, experience, skill, size of group, fitness level. So these are the things that we're looking at when we're assessing our sea state, for example. In italics below them is the conditions that we have in front of us. Red light, yellow light, green light. What we're going to do on our exercise is at first pass, wave, surf, sea temp, current, tide. If waves are 0.5 meters, sea temp is 5 degrees, it will be high tide to start. Tide goes out as we paddle. depending where we are, tide going in and out may or may not present an issue. It could present issues launching and coming back if the beach is very gradual and suddenly we have to walk a lot further with the boards. That's the case in Spanish Banks, Boundary Bay in this area. It could also create current. So depending on the area we're in, that may or may not be an issue. Waves 0.5 meters high and sea temperature 5, that's some big waves and cold water for our students. So that one to me, at first pass, and I'm looking at, is it a red? Definitely no. Is it a yellow, a maybe, or a green? Well, it's probably a red. Weather, wind speed starting at 9 kilometers west, gust 15 knots, or sorry, 9 knots west, gust 15 knots, increasing through the day, air temp 10 degrees, overcast, no storms. You know, that's a lot of wind. What would you put on that one? Red, yellow, green. Terrain, easy access shoreline, surf breaking approximately 0.3 meters. We can kind of get over that. No boat traffic, urban location, no wildlife to be concerned about. That's sounding pretty good. I'd put a green on that one. Human factor, 6 brand new paddlers with no SUP experience and little to no experience in any water sport, fitness level unknown. That's going to be our typical basic skills course. So if we were using this for our skills course, that's you know, it's not unexpected, but when we start combining it with these other conditions, you know, it's probably a yellow. So then what we do is we take a second pass, we take a first pass and we assign what our colors are, red, yellow, green for each one. And then we take a second pass and say, how do we mitigate these? Are there locations we can use to get out of the wind? Yes, okay, maybe my red dropped to a yellow. Do we have access to exposure gear, wetsuits, booties? Yes, oh, well maybe this drops to a yellow. If the windbreak we're using also creates flat water, this might drop to a green because suddenly 0.5 meters drops to nothing because we have a wind shadow. So this is the overall flow that I want you to get used to, that we'll be looking at. The tools that we have for condition assessment, 4 Ws, we're going to be using in class. 4 pillars is a great one because it takes into account the human factor and breaks out terrain a little bit more, which is super helpful as well. I would use this on a longer trip, a day trip, an overnighter. I would be using more of this. So we take our first pass with the conditions that we know and take into account the conditions changes that we know are expected forecast. And then we take a second pass at it of how can we mitigate the risks that we've identified? Can we mitigate any reds and yellows to make them yellow or green? And then once we've done that, then we look at how many legs do we have left on the table? How many reds do we have? How many yellows and how many greens? And that's what we use to make our go, no go decision. All right, so that's an introduction to risk management. And these are skills that we want to get in the habit of using. We want them to be muscle memory. Every time we're looking around, we want to be looking at wind speed, direction. I check the forecast, I know what's expected. What's the water temperature? Do I need my wetsuit? I have a group of brand new paddlers. I'm not going that direction. I'm not paddling with the wind because we'll never get back. We're going to paddle into the wind, into that wind shadow, because that's where we're going to be able to do our lesson. So these are the things that we need to start doing instinctively. And these tools will help get it to that point where it's just instinct. We need to do it for ourselves to run the lesson. And we want to also use a level of instructing this to our students so they start learning it as well. So the 4 Ws for that. And that'll come into the next section where we're looking at preparedness and our briefing that we're going to be giving the students before we head out. All right, I'll see you in the next lesson.